Okay, so I did make y'all a presentation, which I don't like doing because I had a way of doing this, but I'm even more happy that it's not going to happen, so haha. Okay, so Bruce gave me a title, Beauty, a Powerful Indication of God's Existence. I think that's pretty apt, especially considering where we're going tonight. But before we even get into the nitty-gritty, also I just want to tell you, I love this topic, super excited to talk about it, so I may get like a little wild and crazy. So if I'm looking and seeing glazed eyes, I'm going to try my best to dial it back. But before we can begin getting into all of the philosophical and the apologetics and all of that good stuff, I think it's important that each one of us take a minute and try to put ourselves in the shoes of C.S. Lewis. Now I say that we don't want to have his experience. I want each of you to have your own experience so that you can understand what he's talking about, okay? So my big question to you right now is, what do you consider beautiful? Okay. Now, I was going to play a video of a gentleman playing Clair de Lune on piano, and he's giving a performance. And we're not going to do that, but that's okay. If you know Clair de Lune, it's a beautiful musical piece, just beautiful. Claude Debussy is the composer, and this gentleman who's performing it, something I want to say about Clair de Lune is, if you don't know anything about music, it's not an overly difficult song to play. But the thing that makes it difficult is that the way you phrase it, each phrasing, the way you, the tempo that you set, the dynamics that you pick. As a performer, as an expert performer, you want to be considering those things because that is what elevates a semi-simple piece from amateur level to expert level. And so we could hear an 8-year-old kid who's been learning piano for several years play Clair de Lune, and they're just going to play it as it's written, right? But what makes it beautiful is when you have an expert pianist who understands all the nuances and understands the story that the composer was trying to tell, and then even has their own story that they're trying to tell. I'm going into a lot of detail about this music piece, but that's what I'm trying to get across here, is that when something is beautiful, there's a lot more that goes into it than just what first meets the eye. So there was that piece. I was going to show you a few paintings. I'm sure you've seen Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. Looks completely different from a lot of the paintings during that time, all the brushstrokes. There was Looking Down on Yosemite Valley by Albert Bierstadt. And then I was going to point to these because I know these are here, but these beautiful pictures of Yosemite. Landscape. Going out in nature, looking at landscape, that is beautiful. I find it beautiful. I'm sure we travel places to go look at landscapes, right? And then if you're anything like me, I love reading and I love the art of writing. And so I have several books that I've read where I've just found magnificent passages or lines or something that the author has just beautifully crafted. And I'm going to share with you one of my favorites. It's from one of my favorite books with one of my favorite characters of all time, The Hobbit. I love Bilbo Baggins. So this is a line from The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, not yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It's the very first line of the book. I personally think the whole story is beautiful, but I love that first line because it's familiar. And to me, its beauty comes from the familiarity, because I've read this book several times, and the first line does bring me comfort just knowing the story already. So I wanted to take a minute. Think of something. You can close your eyes. We can get a little uncomfy here for a second. Close your eyes. Think of something that you think is beautiful. And while you're thinking of it, I want you to embrace your 5 senses. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? And what do you feel? Like touch. What do you touch with your hands? And then as you think about this beautiful thing, place, memory, or moment, how do you feel? I'm talking about that center of your chest. How does it make you feel? And what does it make you think about? Okay, you can open your eyes. Everybody thought of something beautiful, yes? Yeah. So I don't know about all of you, But when I think of something beautiful, and for me, I was thinking of the very first time I moved to Missouri, and I was in that Missouri countryside, and everything was green. And when you come from California, where during the summer, everything is yellow and dead and brown and all of that, and crunchy, and you go somewhere and everything is green, it's beautiful. I mean, I can't describe it other than it is beautiful, and it made me feel this like yearning, this like in my chest. I just thought, this is the most beautiful place. That may sound crazy, but I thought it was the most beautiful place. And I knew, looking at it, because I know the Creator, I knew this is beautiful because God made it. This, like, I look at this and I get to see God's design, God's love for his people, God's love for creation. So that brings us to C.S. Lewis's argument from beauty, or argument from desire. Now, C.S. Lewis would argue that the feeling you get when you look at something beautiful is called Sehnsucht. It's a German noun that translates to longing, desire, yearning, or even craving. And he says he found this word, and he says this is the closest, like this word comes the closest to describing that feeling you get when you look at something beautiful. And that means like it doesn't necessarily encapsulate everything, it's just the one that comes the closest. So he argues that when we look at or experience something beautiful, we feel a yearning for something that isn't present with us in that moment of beauty. That in fact, the beautiful thing we are looking at or experiencing causes that feeling of Sehnsucht for something more and beyond that beautiful thing. Because we are looking at the beautiful thing, whatever it is, right? You can think of it in your mind now, and still feel that yearning or desire. We know it can't be the beautiful thing that fulfills the yearning we feel. So the beautiful thing is still in front of us. We still feel this yearning. So that means this thing, this tangible thing in front of us cannot be the thing that satisfies the yearning. There has to be something else that satisfies it. It just points to the fact that there's something that satisfies this yearning. So what is the argument from beauty? I want to take a minute. Ben Holloway, I stumbled across his blog. I think he does a pretty good job of bringing it down in simple terms so that anybody can understand. And I thought that would be good for us to do that before we start adding things to it. So he says, the argument from beauty has a certain intuitive strength. It is roughly as follows. Beauty evokes longing. When we see or hear something of great beauty, we long for something beyond what we think is beautiful. And that is the basis of Lewis's argument and the other people who brought this argument forward before. So I want to come to C.S. Lewis now because he also, the way he talks about it, it makes a lot of sense. There's a funny story with this. So he presents this argument really well in Mere Christianity, and I was looking for this quote, and I couldn't find it in the book. I asked Pastor Aaron. He said, I usually just Google this stuff. And I said, I don't want to Google it, Pastor Aaron. I just want to know what it is. So I just kept looking. Finally, I broke down and Googled it. Google told me page 113, completely wrong. It was on page 136. And now, something to know about me is when I'm processing, I'm very vocal. I do things out loud. Pastor Aaron and Mona, our church secretary, are now very used to it. But some people would come into the office, and I wasn't fully aware that there were new people in the office. So when I found the quote, I screamed out, I found it! And it echoed throughout the office. And I could hear them looking, they sounded a little uncertain talking to Pastor Aaron. They were going to meet with him, and one of them goes, she found it? Very concerned. And he had to explain for me, but anyway, so I found it. Mere Christianity, page 136. This is Lewis explaining this argument. He says, the Christian says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for something else, of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country. He's English, so of course, true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others to do the same. So he says, basis of that, the desire can only be fulfilled by something outside of this world. And I looked up many articles and I read many papers, and several other people talked about this term transcendence, which is like what Lewis is talking about. This idea, this transcendence is a philosophical term. It refers to God, who is outside of this world and is absolute, eternal, and infinite. So looking at beauty, according to Lewis, invokes this longing for something, for transcendence, or God who is outside of this world, and that's what beauty points to. So the reason why I had us think about something beautiful that we consider beautiful is because, we did it through our memories. Hopefully you were remembering something from your past, because that's exactly how Lewis came to understand this feeling. He was standing as a young man. This was before he believed in Christ, and he was thinking about, just like this memory suddenly popped into his head like it does from his childhood, and it was this toy garden that his brother had. And he said it was the first time he had ever thought of something as beautiful. And he said, standing there on the side of the road, he's walking, it invoked this deep longing in him. And he didn't understand where that longing or desire came from, and he didn't know how to fulfill it. He just knew that he felt it. And then later we know, Mere Christianity concludes this for us, that he realized that desire, looking at that beautiful thing, it was what pointed him to, he understood what it was doing was pointing him to God. And he understood the only thing that could fulfill that desire was God. So I say that. I think it's important for us to understand that feeling, so that part of this argument that I'm trying to make, and that several other people make, is that C.S. Lewis's argument from beauty may not always be able to stand on its own, depending on who you're talking to. I would say if you're going to talk to, one of the most famous atheists and all of that, who've done their studying and all of that, it may be difficult to just bring this argument against them. But if we're talking to somebody who's in the grocery store, or we've been talking to for some time, or a friend, somebody who doesn't believe in Jesus at the moment, and we can talk about this idea of longing, we can use this argument of beauty to kind of push them and challenge them to consider the hole that they have, that they want to fill, because we all have it. So those who would want to, I talked about that. Now, it is important to consider the counter-arguments. That's what I was getting to. Lost my train of thought. To consider the counter-arguments. There are 4 that I found from a couple of gentlemen who, they're pretty big critics of this particular argument of Lewis's. They may be critics of other arguments of Lewis's, but I know they're definitely critics of this argument. And they ask a few questions that they believe kind of pick this argument apart. And my hope is that we look at these counter-arguments, and then in some of the studies and papers I've read, I found a couple rebuttals that I think I wanted to share, because then if you're talking about this with somebody and you bring up this argument, I'd like for you to be able to have some answers. So one of the first counter-arguments is joy, or that Sehnsucht feeling, that yearning, as Lewis describes it, as a pang, a stab, a fluttering in the diaphragm, more properly characterized as an emotion rather than as a type of desire. And this question, as I understand it, wants to separate those two words, emotion from desire. Because if it's just an emotion, then you can explain it away. But if it's an actual desire, then the next question will bring this into context. If it's an actual desire, then the idea that some people believe is that natural selection and secular humanism, that evolution is what provokes desires, and all the desires that lead to survival are the only ones that stay. So in trying to separate emotion from desire, they're trying to be able, if they can explain it as an emotion, they're trying to be able to explain it away as that's subjective, that doesn't have any basis, not everybody feels that. But if it's in a desire, then as the second question says, is it a natural desire in the relevant sense? Is it innate and universal, for example, like the biological desires Lewis cites? And those biological desires are hunger, or like for a duckling wanting to swim, all of that. So if it is a desire, we now have to be able to explain, is it universal? Meaning, does everybody feel it, okay? And then the third counter argument is joy, or Sehnsucht, and the sense of a spiritual longing for the transcendent, relevantly similar to the kinds of innate biological desires Lewis mentions, or does the argument depend on a weak analogy? And then lastly, do we know or have good reason to believe that all natural desires have possible satisfactions? Can this desire actually be satisfied? Does every desire have to be satisfied, or is there actually an object of satisfaction for every single desire? That's the question that's posed there. And they say, don't humans naturally desire many things that don't seem to be attainable? Example given, to possess superhuman or magical powers, to know the future, to remain youthful and unaffected by the ravages of time, and so forth. Is the natural desire for perfect and eternal happiness more like these fantasy type desires? So wouldn't this idea of like eternal happiness or an idea of God, wouldn't that be equivalent to some magic or superhuman powers or anything like that, okay? So now, those are those counter arguments. I have a few rebuttals that I found that I particularly like. Dr. Donald T. Williams. Hold on, 2 more questions. He brings up 2 more questions. Is the existence of a desire, in fact, evidence of the object of that desire? Similar to question number 4. Do people actually experience a real desire that no finite temporal thing can satisfy? That's a question, personally. Do people actually experience this desire, this yearning that we're talking about? That question, I think, is a good question, because how do you prove that every single person feels this? Okay, I have an answer that I did some studying on, so I have an answer, but we'll get there. Okay, so there's this gentleman, Slater Simek. I'm not going to go into too much detail about his paper. A lot of it was over my head because it had to do with math. But he was trying to figure out the success, whether Lewis's argument was successful. So he used a probability theorem to try to discover that. He went in, the paper was great, but I was like, I don't know, this is a lot to try to figure out. And he gave, percentage quantities to things that you wouldn't think would have percentage quantities. So, but he did bring up counter arguments similar to the ones we had here. Specifically, the second one that asked the question, if joy is it a natural desire in the relevant sense? Is it innate and universal? So that question asking, does it relate to everybody? Because if it doesn't relate to everybody, then the critic would say, well, then if it doesn't relate to everybody, then we can't call it a desire. So Simek did some research and he found a study. And so Lewis also talks about sexual desire. So Simek found a study that proved not every person experiences sexual desire. So in fact, in this study, 1% of the global population is asexual, meaning that roughly 76 million people experience a lack of sexual desire. And this is relevant as a rebuttal to that counter-argument, that question, because sexual desire is transcultural and is prevalent to the extent of normal universality, despite it not being universal in the sense that it applies to everyone everywhere, meaning enough people feel it that the people that don't feel it invite inspection or question rather than they're the normal and these other people are weird. So Simek uses that example to kind of back up Lewis in saying, this desire may not be universal, but if enough people feel it, which I believe enough people do, right? We can listen to music today, we can watch movies today, we can read stories today. People talk about something missing. People talk about wanting something more. That proves this desire is felt by a lot of people. If it's that universal, they're going to put it in a famous song, movie story, or book story, whatever. So if enough people feel it, the people that claim to not feel it invite inspection. They're not seen as the norm. And that's the rebuttal to that question. Does it have to be universal? No, it just has to have normal universality, meaning enough people, a majority feel this desire for it to be significant. So my belief, though, I look at Ecclesiastes 3:11, and it says God has put eternity on the hearts of man. So I believe every single person feels this desire. I believe it's one of those desires like hunger where there's not a single person in this world who doesn't feel it. But I will get to why I believe some people will claim they don't feel it. And I think that's where that's where this argument can be a little bit hairy when we get to that point. But, I went too quickly. Okay, we're going to get there. Counter argument number 4. Do we know or have good reason to believe that all natural desires have possible satisfactions? And then in simpler terms, as Dr. Donald T. Williams promotes, do people actually experience a real desire that no finite temporal thing can satisfy? And so as Williams brings up, he actually answers it with one of Lewis's quotes. He says, Lewis answers that being hungry doesn't prove you will be fed, but it does prove that you have a body that needs nourishment, and that presumably, therefore, some kind of food exists. Therefore, the desire for paradise does not prove that you are going to go there, but it does seem to indicate that such a thing exists. And so these counter-arguments provide that basis for the main reason that Lewis's argument may not be able to stand on its own. Because this desire exists, though it may point to something beyond, to many people, not all, I believe everybody feels it, but semantics. It does not necessarily mean that every person will believe it for themselves. And that's where we get into the difficulty possibly with this argument. You will have some people that will claim they don't feel it. And the reason being, there are some who reject the notion of God so deeply and vehemently that they will believe that desire they feel can be filled by something in the natural world. And Dr. Donald T. Williams even says the faith component in committing one's life to Christ cannot be eliminated. The argument from desire cannot be fully evaluated except experientially. Only when a person in honest reckons with the fact that the final finding is just not going to happen in this world is he ready to consider the conclusion Lewis reached, as in, unless a person has come to the end of themselves and they have tried every single thing this world has to offer and they've decided, okay, none of this works, I'm just going to have to go to God now because he's the final thing. That's when somebody will admit this yearning that I feel exists and it has to be satisfied by him because I've already tried all these other things and they don't work. And so Williams brings up this faith component is a huge thing when it comes to this argument. Now I have this by Peter S. Williams, From Beauty to the Existence of God. I have this paper. I highly recommend reading it. He does a phenomenal job breaking down this argument while also including another way to argue beauty points to God. And so I'm going to include a little bit of that here. I didn't want to go into all of it because there's too much of it's good, and I didn't want to take up your whole evening. So he's a Christian philosopher and apologist, and his entire argument in this paper is that because humans, not even just that, looking at something beautiful points to God. He's saying because humans can even recognize beauty, that is evidence for God. The fact that we can even look at something and say, that is beautiful, it's evidence for God. And so there's something in this paper I wanted to share because I think it's so cool. He talked about art. And he said, if you look at art during the 1700s, and we know during the mid-1700s, the Great Awakening happened, where it was like Christian revival, and people started believing in God. If you look at art during that time, even into the 1800s, it is serene. It's filled with joy. There's a lot of light in those paintings. And it's very landscape-oriented. So people are looking at God's creation, and in a way, it may seem like they're worshiping the creation, but I've seen a lot of those paintings, and there's always a light coming from above. So to me, I look at that, and I think they know who made the beautiful thing they're looking at. So they're painting it like that. But if you look at art today, and in the world today, people believe God is dead, right? Nobody wants to believe in God. They say that's all made up hocus pocus. If you look at art today, it is dark, it is moody, it is angry, and I think the most important thing is it is self-oriented. There are so many paintings today, I know because I looked at a bunch of them, that depict people, lone people, with all of these weird colors and with like sad looks on their faces. They're self-portraits, if you will. So no more are we looking at others as in the 1700s. We're now focused on ourselves. And this is what happens when you reject God, when God is outside of the equation. So, Peter S. Williams, he separates these arguments. So he actually takes it, I would say, a step further than Lewis, and he separates this argument of beauty into 4 arguments. I'm going to focus on 2 because that's what he did. So type A, work from the nature of our subjective aesthetic experience, seeking to interpret this experience as revelatory of divinity. That's essentially Lewis's argument. You look at something beautiful, it points to God. And then there's type D, propose the existence of God as the source and standard of objective aesthetic values. So God is the standard for beauty. Like, that's the argument there. And so he provides a couple quotes that I think are significant. The first one I love. It's one of the first quotes, or one of the first thing he quotes in his paper. Humans have numerous features that are more easily explained by theism than by metaphysical naturalism, if only because metaphysical naturalism currently explains all human capacities in terms of their ability to enhance survival. I don't know about you, but whenever I think about the desires God has given me, the last thing I want to think about is whether this desire is meant for, like, it helps me survive on this planet. That's the most, like, I don't know how to explain what I'm trying to say, but anyway, it's abstract. It's absence, void of feeling is what I'm trying to say, void of love. Among these features, the ones that point to theism are the possession of reliable faculties aimed at truth, the appreciation of beauty, and a sense of humor. So Peter S. Williams says, in experiencing beauty, we feel, he took this from Anthony O'Hear. Anthony O'Hear was an atheist, and he had come to a point in his life where he was looking at the world around him and at beauty, and he made this discovery. He says, in experiencing beauty, we feel ourselves to be in contact with a deeper reality than the everyday. But how could we think of an aesthetic justification of experience unless our aesthetic experience was sustained by a divine will, revealed in the universe, and particularly in our experience of it as beautiful? When I first read this, I was like, oh, this guy's a Christian. Like, he understands it's God. And then the next sentence floored me. But such a resolution, that there's a divine will, such a resolution is intellectually unsustainable. So aesthetic experience, however powerful, remains subjective, and in its full articulation, illusory. So he got to this point where he realized there's got to be something outside that is like making these beautiful things and that these beautiful things point to. But then at the end, he just can't take that next step and believe in God. So he says all of this, that argument cannot be supported. So it doesn't work. And then Peter S. Williams makes this quote, finally, there is objective beauty in books and music, but these things also stir within us a desire for a beauty greater than themselves, which we seem to apprehend through their beauty. It is as if their finite beauty is a derived quality that draws our aesthetic attention into the heaven of underived and absolute beauty. On the theistic view of things, this as if finds its fulfillment. And essentially, it all comes back to this one point, all the way from the beginning that C.S. Lewis makes back, all the way through to Peter S. Williams. In beauty, the human finds longing for something more and beyond the natural world. That is the argument from beauty. I did a lot of research for this, but I tried really hard to keep it in, 30 or so minutes, but hopefully I can answer some questions about this if you have them. Anyway, yes?
Can you get a little bit closer and kind of get in a circle and I'm going to sit over there and you're going to sit over here.
Okay, if I need this microphone.
Hello. If you're going to ask a question, please do it in the mic. And Becca, you stay on stage.
Okay.
You got to field questions up there.
Oh, I almost fell. Can I stay right here or no?
Probably. You can sit on the front. Let me check that. Just easier to sit down, I think, if you want.
I'm okay if I stand right here. I feel shorter here.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I have a question. Is there universality with regards to what humans determine is beautiful? If you have a picture of a person, a picture of geography, a piece of art, is there a universal standard that all human beings say, that's beautiful? Or is there some anomaly there?
So I think, especially when I'm going to take this approach where if I want to think about this argument, I'm going to go, if I work with teens, okay? I'm working with teens. I don't think every single teen is going to think the same thing is beautiful. We're all humans. Every single human has different ideas of what beauty is. What I do think, though, is that's important is that everything we think is beautiful, the fact that we can identify it as beautiful, and then whatever we think is beautiful, it has to point to God. That's the reason why we think it's beautiful, right? If God, I believe God is the standard of beauty, so that means whatever we think is beautiful points to him. And if I'm looking at this argument thinking, okay, I know I can talk to the average teenager about their longings and using the beauty to be able to get them to God, whatever they think is beautiful is going to work. I don't know if
So
I
the
answered
answer
your
would be
question.
no, then. There's
No.
not universality.
No.
Okay, yeah.
I
Thank
would
you.
say no.
So it's going to work. How does it, okay. Thank you. So you know that the argument from whatever the kid thinks is beautiful is going to work. So how would you use that to guide them into belief in God?
Nice, yeah. So it's interesting, especially if I think about the way Lewis came to know God. From looking at something beautiful, he felt that longing, that Sehnsucht. So I think what I would do is have as I'm talking to, I'm just going to use a teenager because that's who I talk to more often. If I'm talking to a teenager, I would want to sit there and understand the beautiful thing that they think is beautiful. I'd want them to explain it. I want them to describe it to me. I'd want them to help me see its beauty as well. And then talk about how does it make you feel? And use that feeling and kind of point to, okay, there's this beautiful thing. Does it satisfy everything, all of your needs? Does it satisfy all of your desires? And I would say the answer has to be no. This beautiful thing can't satisfy all of your desires. So then is there anything that satisfies all of your desires? They're going to think about, we could come up with answers to that, like food, clothes, materialistic things, social media, friends, people, right? Do your parents satisfy all of your desires? All of these things are going to be met with no. So is there anything on this earth that satisfies all of your desires? Well, no, because none of those things worked. So there has to be, we still feel this yearning. We still feel this desire for something to be filled, right? We still want something more. We want somebody to know us fully. There has to be something to satisfy that desire. And then I could bring in God in that instance. Yeah.
Can you recap the four counter arguments, just off the top of your head? The four counter arguments to the beauty.
Yeah, I know there are four, but I would say the main ones are those two that we had rebuttals to. One of them being, do all desires or does this desire have a universality to it? And then, just because there is this desire, does that mean there is an object to satisfy that desire? I think those two are the other main questions. The other two kind of come in underneath those as well. So, because one of them questions is it a bad analogy? Which it may be, but we can still get people to God with it, so it's fine.
So we talked a lot about, something you see, that's beautiful. So my question is, what about, say, a conversation where you're not necessarily looking at something, but you are in depth in a conversation with someone and they say something that really touches you, or vice versa, and then that phrase is so often said in the middle of a conversation, wow, that was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Or reading poetry. So my question is, even if it's not a visual or a tactical thing, a thought, something intellectual or something that comes from your soul. It's still the same concept. And you can still drive that towards God. Do you see that happening?
Absolutely. Yeah, I know I talked a lot about what you can see, but I think music, I think art, I think the written word, I think even just talking to somebody and realizing this is a beautiful moment even. Anything really that you find beautiful or that somebody else finds beautiful can be used. Because the key thing is, as long as they think it's beautiful, it can be used.
I can't help but think of the expression that's been out for years where beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And my question to you is, are you currently practicing this with your youth group? Questioning them like you talked about tonight?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually have not. I just started studying this, and I'm trying to figure out how do I introduce this to them and then start working with them on this idea of beauty pointing to God. Because I don't think I could give that presentation and they would follow me. So I have to be strategic in how I think about it. But I do plan on working on with my teens. And then we're actually talking about apologetics right now, and we're answering questions that a lot of people come up in questioning the faith in God and the Bible and all of that. So I'm thinking this could be a pretty good way for them to look at the kids around them and even see or find or have a way to be able to talk about apologetics and God and point them to God, just using something like as simple as beauty.
I'd be curious down the road if you do this as to your findings as to whether the boys and versus the girls are more interested. I could see where the boys, that's the last thing they want to think about, and they're missing out. But when you start speaking of the thing beautiful, they might say, well, wait a minute. I'm not interested in that, whereas the girls might be. I don't know. I don't know if that's a chauvinist approach, but I'd be curious how this works out in your youth group in the future.
Absolutely. I'll have to keep you updated. Also, I wonder, too, if, as you're bringing up ideas in my head, if I isolated the boys and just spoke to them so they didn't have any girls in the room. Although if I'm talking about my particular youth group, a lot of the girls are the boys' sisters, so it may not matter. But even some of the other ones, just being able to talk to them by themselves and then bring up this idea, and then maybe they won't be so nervous to talk about something beautiful if there weren't any girls in the room.
Because I can't help but, I have to admit here, when you were saying what's beautiful, I was thinking like a really nice looking car.
That's perfect.
But the guys might be thinking along those lines, and that's more materialistic as opposed to something abstract. Glacier Point came to mind too, but I have to admit that the car thing came in. So you'd have to know my background to understand that.
Anyone else have a question
Yeah.
before I ask a second one?
Yeah.
Go ahead, please. Please go ahead, Liz.
I'll kind of be a closing thing.
Okay.
I'll throw a bunch of questions at her.
Oh, man.
I think that the boys will probably be thinking about the girls is what they'll be thinking. But conversely, what about the ugly, the disgusting, and the macabre? In the sense of pointing to God, kind of like justice versus injustice. A sense of justice and righteousness points to God, but also evil. The fact that we can discern evil does also point that there has to be good, there has to be God. So do you think that, again, the disgusting, the ugly, and the macabre also can point to God?
I think that
Or the devil?
Yeah, I think that argument may be a longer conversation to get to God, but I definitely think those things point to a fallen nature in the fallen world, and so using that approach, I think I could get somebody to at least have a conversation about God. Truth and beauty would have to come in there eventually, so yeah. We could contrast beautiful versus ugly, beautiful versus gross, and the macabre and all of that, so that may be a good picture too.
It's a good consideration. I dream of a world where microphones always work. And apparently it just doesn't happen here too much, but what? It's a thing going on. It's like Hopalong Cassidy is in here in ghost form. Okay, let me ask you just a few questions to pair with some Lewisinian literary themes.
Okay.
Shadowlands. Shadowlands, have you've read anything about Lewis's idea of Shadowlands?
I feel like I've heard of it, but I don't think I haven't studied it.
Okay, the idea, it pairs very nicely with St. Jude, and that is that Shadowlands, Lewis puts forth as beautiful as things may be here, they are a mere shadow of the reality and the substance and the overwhelming beauty beyond that is there. And we haven't experienced that, but when we touch beauty of any kind, we yearn for it. It's a painful gut yearning sometimes when you have that yearning. When you fell in love with the girl in 7th grade, and later on you were praying Garth Brooks' prayer, thank God for unanswered prayers, when you found out what happened later in her life, but at this point, there's things we desire, but there's a perfection that we can't reach here. You want to get married and you want to never have an argument. That's your dream. You're never going to have an argument. Ain't going to happen on planet Earth that I have discovered, okay? It just hasn't happened. In heaven, I'm praying that there's not a lot of arguments. Does that make sense? And I think that will be attained in perfection. But when perfection comes, is what the Bible says. Okay, so Shadowlands, which he'll refer to a lot, especially when talking about Aslan and things like that, the Shadowlands. It's that right now we're in the Shadowlands. And we see beauty, but it's like Paul's statement, though we see dimly now, we see darkly. We don't see, we're looking as in a mirror darkly. We can't really see the full glory of this. And for him, a mirror was a piece of copper that was polished. Pathetic compared to our mirrors now. When we see heaven, we'll go, oh man, okay? So beauty, when you talk about music. I'm also going to pull in just a little bit of Pascal's argument, okay? Which Pascal's argument is saying that there is a vacuum in each of us that cannot be filled by anything but the person of Jesus Christ, the love of God in the person of Jesus Christ. That's perfection, okay? You like love, but we only get a shadow of it here. We don't get full love, the full draft, and probably we may not even be able to handle it. We'd turn into a puddle on the ground, nothing left. If we felt the presence of Christ in his fullness, have you ever been in a place where you felt the fullness of Christ in the room? You can't handle it. It's like when they dedicated the temple and the priests all had to fall out on the ground to avoid touching the presence of God. We only get a part. We only get a part, and part of it's because this that we're in right now probably can't handle it. That's my theory. We can't handle all of that. So Shadowlands and Pascal's vacuum argument, as it were, that what we get right now is just a piece of it because it's all we can handle. I mean, I'm sure a few of you have had the dream of flying. Anybody had a dream of flying all by yourself? And you take off on the ground and you gain your own elevation. You ever done that? It's like, I want that, okay? But it can't happen here, okay? That is a desire that I wish for that can't happen here. Is there anything I desire for? Yeah, if you give me enough time to think about it, okay? I've got a ton of things. See, Dan would like a 57 Chevy that flies on its own. Would that not be cool? Go out and get in the car tonight and just, instead of going out this way, just take off that end of the parking lot over the trees. It'd be so awesome. The sexual argument. 1% of the people on earth are not attracted by sexuality. I would argue that they are. But what they are satisfied with is a mere shadow of physical materialism, and the sensation they get in that level. But there's something behind knowing and being known that is beyond the shadowlands of what sexuality is meant to be. A oneness that is beyond all mere that. So I would argue it flips the argument on its head. It says there's something you want and you can't get it through mere physical. It won't never do it for you. you're kind of a transcended person, if you believe that, if that's what you feel. There's things you desire, and if we all sat and thought about it for a while. So for a kid, say, what is it you want? What is it you greatly desire? What if everybody really loved you? What if everybody really respected you? Ain't gonna happen here. It's not gonna happen. You will not have a free ride through this. Madonna said, the only time I feel loved is when I'm standing in front of 15,000 people in a performance, and the minute I leave the stage, I'm me again, and I'm no longer loved. Okay, you know what? I can show her a person that loves her all the time. Okay, that's where the love resides. And you will never experience it until you see that beauty. Music is one of my main arguments in terms of the argument from beauty. When our oldest daughter, Sarah was, how old was she standing in front of the stereo? 9 months, maybe, eight months, something like that. And she's just toddling around and hanging on to stuff. And I had the Peer Gynt Suite on my stereo, which the Peer Gynt Suite is just a massively wonderful, I like everything that the guy wrote and the symphonies that he did. And she's listening to this music as she's just playing around. And then one of the movements called the Death of A's, A-A-S-E, came on. And it's this long, sonorous dirge that kind of prefigures a death. It figures a funeral of a king. And she just, all of a sudden, her eyes just welled up. She's 8 or 9 months old, and she just starts going crazy, weeping to her soul on this thing. And I turned the music off, and she was okay. About an hour later, I thought, well, let's try this again, see if this is the same effect. Same effect. She just melted down from this. And I just have to ask you, there's no words, no lyrics, but the music affected her so emotionally. Question, why do mere tonalities and vibrations affect you emotionally? Where does that come from? And sometimes it's so beautiful you can't contain it. Now, the argument that materialists will make is that everything that you find beautiful in some way helps your survival, assists survival, pure survival, that's it. So I understand that. I think a beautiful T-bone done directly over a flame, you know, to just medium rare with the right kind of seasoning, is that a thing of beauty or what? Okay, and I understand that. That helps my survival, or actually it doesn't, but that's, I think it does. But, or a good ice cream thing down at the ice cream parlor, or whatever. Those are things of some beauty. Of course, as a male young man, I would look at women and think, that's beautiful, okay? And, but why do I sit out and look at the stars when the night is just turning from that pre-night thing into this kind of a purplish glow and a bluish thing in the sky, and you're watching all the stars out there, they're gleaming, and then a star comes shooting across the sky, and you go, oh man. In what way does that provide for my survival? When I look at the mountains and the snow-capped hills and I see flowers perfectly formed that I can't eat, why do I think they're beautiful? Okay, you've heard of the Golden Triangle in terms of, you had asked about, is there some common things about physical? Yeah, the Golden Triangle, I think, is what it's called. Brad Pitt supposedly has it. I don't know it, you know, but it's basically this formula, this mathematical formula. They can tell if you're really good looking, you've got this, everything's in perfect order, you know. And I think behind that, though, is we like form, we like beauty, we like things that make sense, we like things that are not chaotic. The beauty of Alfred Bierstadt's stuff of Yosemite Valley and of what you call it, Hetchy Hetchy. He's an artist, and I didn't understand his stuff in the beginning because it's a little bit dark. It's that time, the light is dark. But when you look at it longer, like you said, the light is coming in from above, and pretty soon it kind of transcends. You're looking at it for a while, and you go, whoa, this is like magical. It's magical. It's not what it started out to be. I see some sense behind what's going on here. So all of that, if you think about it, that points toward an orderly God, a God who can design things far more astute than we could even imagine to do. And when we see his signature, we go, that's home. That's where I belong. I have done many interviews over the years. Linda is aware of some of them. She knows some of them, people who've died and who've had an experience in the near-death experience. Almost without exception, they'll find themselves in a place that they think is heaven. It may be slightly different in some ways, but almost without exception, they hear music. And they say the music overwhelmed me. It was more beautiful than any music I've ever heard on earth. It made sense. I was home. Okay, so can you get it here? No, you can't get music like there's been people who attempt it. We no longer attempt it, it doesn't look like to me. But the masters of the Renaissance and of those eras came closer to it, and the church came closer to it. When church had command of arts, art was the most beautiful it ever became. So the argument from beauty to anybody is what is it you wish for that you can't seem to get here? Because he's got it. And when you see him, you'll get it. And do I want sexuality, or do I want connection? Do I want to be known, to know and to be known and be loved even though I'm known? There's only one place in the universe I can get that. I really only one place when you do all the math. So any questions beyond that? I know I kind of...
I was just thinking the idea of that triangle, I know what you're talking about, the symmetrical and
Yes.
the perfect face or whatever. That's the key, I think, is when people look at that, they look and they see what they think is perfection.
Yes.
But I think we crave perfection,
Yeah.
knowing we're never going to find it here on this earth, and
Yeah.
so that still points to God. We seek after perfection. Some people not realizing that we once had it in the garden and it was with God
Yeah.
and all of that. So, yeah.
Do you have any idea, if you can imagine, just spin a thought experiment sometime, and imagine in your mind, take 5 minutes, which is a long time, and you take 5 minutes and imagine, what's it going to be like when you go in through the gates of heaven? Who's going to be there? What's it going to look like? What's the landscape? The river of life, what's it look like? What are those things? Where's the tree of life there? What's that look like? When will you see Jesus? What is he going to look like? What will you look like? And you begin to understand what that argument from beauty really means. Because I think what we desire is the kingdom. I think what we desire when everything is under the lordship and the control of one who makes sense out of everything, rather than a total chaotic craziness that we're facing in the world right now. Everybody's going to get along there. That's my idea of what I can achieve here. Nobody's been able to do it yet. Nobody can find nirvana. Nobody can find this wonderful place, but it's there. And if I like Lewis's idea, if we desire it, it's like the things we do desire that we can fulfill here. If we desire something, it's because there is a satisfaction of that somewhere. If I'm hungry, I desire food, it's because somewhere in the world there's food. I may not be able to get it right now, but my body desires it because that's the way I'm made. If I desire anything, there's an answer for that, but when there's something I can't find an answer for on this earth, his argument is it must be because you weren't made ultimately for this earth. That's the argument. You wouldn't have that ingrained in you, Ecclesiastes 3 or 13, what is it? 3:11. Thank you, my brain just went. For God has placed eternity in the heart of every man. So what's that even mean, you know? Somebody had asked me the other day, what are you going to look like in heaven? I said, I have no idea. How old are you going to be in heaven? Well, I don't know, you kind of hope. I hope it's whenever I was the best looking, you know, in my life. And Ecclesiastes, I think, 3 would argue against that. you become made in his image as you always have been. He is the great I am. You just are. You don't have an age anymore. You just are. It's you. And you don't have to strive anymore to be loved. Wouldn't that be a great place? Wouldn't that be a great desire? It's not available here. It's something you will not get here. Okay? That's the argument from beauty. If you're loved, anybody have grandparents that just loved them because they loved them? You felt like, I don't have to do it. My parents don't always love me, but my grandparents seem to always love me, and they always have cookies and stuff like that. Well, that's you know, that's the argument from beauty. God has made beauty, and it is accessible, but it's only accessible in him. So, anyway, anything else to close us with?